The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/gettyhymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. You are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend Rachel Zhang. Rachel is an assistant professor at Emerson College. Her research focuses on the intersection of politics, religion, and literary form in early modern literature. This is very exciting because my PhD is also in early modern literature, but from a different angle. Rachel's first book, Reimagining Constancy in the English Civil Wars, was published last year in 2024 by Edinburgh University Press, and it shows how the conservative language of constancy underwrites radical innovation in literary form and religio-political thought in the 17th century. Rachel's a graduate of Princeton and of Oxford. I have to sort of spit or cough or something when I say that word, but you know, nobody's perfect. And also she holds her PhD from Columbia University. Rachel's published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and is a contributing editor for the Poulter Project at Northwestern University. She loves exploring Boston with her husband and their two curious daughters. I have the pleasure of knowing Rachel, her husband, and the curious daughters, and they are indeed curious in the best sense, as in not sort of strange and weird, but adventurous and interested in things. In particular, Rachel's daughters are sometimes to be seen in their almost always in beautiful little dresses, running around after my rambunctious and rather badly behaved 6-year-old son, Luke. So I think we'll just give them all the kind of curious label and hope that it turns out well for them.
Yes, and I should say, I do not put them in the fancy puffy dresses. They choose it themselves. Also, actually, many of the dresses I haven't even bought. So.
I fully believe this. Yes, yes. I have 2 daughters and a son, as listeners may or may not know, and it's kind of fun because my daughters are just wildly different from each other. So people sometimes say, "Oh, is it really different having a son?" And I'm like, "Well, yes, but it was really different having my second daughter." So I don't know what to tell you. They're sort of all over the map. But Rachel and I share, you know, aside from being on different sides of the Oxford-Cambridge debate, which we will set aside for the purposes of goodwill in this conversation.
And listeners understand the correct answer to that is Oxford anyway. So,
well, yeah, who would you trust, the one with the English accent or the one with the American accent when it comes to English universities? Anyway, as I said, we're setting it aside.
Sorry, we could keep going.
Yeah, we could have like a whole entire hour's podcast on this, but we will spare you, gentle listener, from that pain. What were we saying we have in common? Oh, yes, we have in common that we both spent years studying for PhDs in literature, and not only literature, but literature from hundreds of years ago. So we've spent untold hours sitting in libraries, reading books written by people who died centuries before our time, and finding them to be curious, interesting, and in many ways kind of relevant to our lives today and to our world today. So maybe we'll start there, Rachel. Why did you choose to spend years studying English literature?
Well, I guess there are really two answers to that question. One, how did I start? And then two, why did I keep going? Well,
Yes.
The answer to the first question is I was in college, and my advisor gave me this wonderful and fascinating 17th century manuscript. And now I think I can say the thing that fascinated me about it, it was a manuscript of a woman grappling with how do you write, or how do you even just respond generally to political instability? Because she was talking about, she was responding to the events of the English Civil Wars, and she was writing all about that, but in very different ways, in very different genres. And I was just fascinated that I'd never seen someone so clearly make a connection between her own life, her writing, and what was happening in the wider world. So that fascinated me. And then why did I keep going is, like that now that I think of it, like that theme of looking at the connection between people's lives and their literature and their political world is actually a lot of what I do still, but just in a slightly different context. But I think the thing that I love now, especially now that I'm teaching different types of literature, is that I get to think about, as you say, like these big questions. Like I'm constantly teaching works by Homer and Virgil, and one of the big tensions there is how do you understand the fact that things seem to be outside of our control? So many things seem to be outside of our control, and yet we have to believe that our actions matter. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't get up in the morning. So a lot of the texts that I teach and that I study are really concerned with big questions of that type. Like, how do we engage with the world in light of these big ideas about the world?
Yeah. That's fascinating, because I was actually reading just this morning. The book I'm currently working on is looking at how Christianity, I guess, sort of how Christian sexual ethics was very different from the sexual ethics of the Greco-Roman Empire, and then how sort of charting a history of Christian sexual ethics between then and now, and how some of our thinking today kind of relates to some of the radical innovations and upsets of the Christian view at that time. And one of the things I was reflecting on this morning is how the way that the Greeks and Romans thought about sex was not disconnected from the stories they told about their gods. And how actually the way that Christians think about sex is profoundly connected to the big story that the Bible tells about who God is and how God in Christ, in Jesus, came to earth for love of his people. And there's a sort of picture of Christian marriage as being like a scale model of Jesus' love for his people, and the sort of one flesh union then. And it's sort of interesting to hear you mention there, reading the works of literature written by people who are living in different, not only sort of different times and different places, but in different worlds where the universe and the sort of divine is thought about very differently. Whereas I guess what you were studying for your PhD and what I was studying for mine when I was studying Shakespeare is the sort of religious world, at least at a basic level, was Christian, albeit there's a whole lot of debate going on about exactly what that looks like.
Yeah, we were studying a period where the most insulting thing you can call someone is an atheist.
Right. Right. Well, and that's funny because today, I mean, I was thinking just this morning about, if somebody read your bio, they would not think, oh, there goes a sort of Bible-believing Christian. I'm not saying that, your life speaks to something else. I just mean your sort of academic background is not one that people would immediately associate with, somebody who takes the Bible exceedingly seriously as God's word and trusts in Jesus as their savior. And then in actual fact, the sort of academic world that you've historically inhabited, and certainly that I inhabited, when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge, was one where, far from it being an insult to call somebody an atheist, you were considered pretty weird to be a very serious Christian. So I'm curious for your thoughts as you have spent time studying literature and engaging, with friends and colleagues and students and others who've been coming from very different angles and perhaps would think that you're pretty weird to be serious in your faith in Jesus. Yeah, how has your how's your study of literature been informed by your faith?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do those two things go hand in hand, or do you feel like it's a sort of tension? Or tell us more about how you've experienced that.
Well, I mean, I think like your question even implies there is a certain privilege in being able to say that my period is a time when people at least engaged with the same beliefs that I often hold. So as opposed to Greco-Roman fields where talking about those texts, you are talking about a completely different worldview. Whereas in the 16th and 17th century, the civil wars, they're fighting over which version of Christianity is the best, right? Like that's so they share a lot of basic premises, and it's interesting because as I've gone through my studies, I've actually encountered a lot of people who are like, "Oh, you're so lucky you're a Christian studying this period because you can actually understand what they're talking about."
Right.
So, when I teach Milton, for instance, I have to often go back to very basics of what is predestination, what is, how does Genesis relate to Jesus, right? And so I have to explain to them that, the fallenness that we see in Genesis is redeemed by Jesus. And that's why Milton makes this weird leap from talking about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve to all of a sudden, he's talking about this vision of Jesus and the redemption. And my students are like, wait, I thought we were in Genesis. How did we get to Genesis? So there is an element, and I've had actually advisors say to me, like, it's so good that you have a knowledge of the Bible because you can actually pick up on things that other people don't. And so I think there is kind of, there is kind of an intellectual advantage in being a Christian in this period. But there are a lot of people, and I'm sure you've encountered a lot of people in academia who, maybe they grew up in a Christian household and they have that knowledge as well. But I do think what it makes me different from a scholar that maybe grew up in a Catholic home or a Protestant home or any sort of Christian background is that I take the claims of people seriously. So because so many I've had very atheistic, I've known very well, atheists who are teaching Milton, and they approach it from a perspective as he is always motivated by politics. He's always motivated by power and always motivated by kind of a concern for what's happening right now. And whereas I think, as Christians, we understand the idea that we are not only motivated by what is immediately happening around us. We are also motivated by thinking, what does the Bible say, right? There is an authority higher than people, and it is the Bible, right? And we are thinking we are motivated by, these are things that we can do that the Bible has asked us to do, and that, and that changes our perspective when we know that even after we die, that life doesn't end. It keeps on going. And this is not the only world there is. That can entirely change your perspective on what's happening in the present. And so I've encountered that's one difference between the work that I do and the work of non-Christians is I just take these people seriously, that they honestly they are exploring these questions with a similar honesty and sincerity that I am. And I think that's hard for someone who does not know what it is to believe something outside themselves that's higher than themselves. I think that's hard to appreciate.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. And it's not to say that, as we read somebody like Milton's work, that he's sort of operating in a vacuum politically, or has no reference to what's happening around him. Right. But at the same time, to be able to say, just as every person who is writing today, whether it's works of fiction or history or whatever, all of us are going to have, our core beliefs are going to influence how we think and what we say, and that we can't be sort of reduced to pure political machines, especially those who, have a sincere faith, albeit, always embedded in the circumstances that we're in. What would you say to somebody who, maybe is a very serious Christian and is perhaps sort of skeptical of or nervous about people getting serious in the study of literature or sort of immersing themselves in fiction of various kinds? We know the the persuasive power of fiction and the kind of worlds that an author can create for us and sort of invite us into. And I think there are some who, for reasonable reasons think, well, we shouldn't really be spending our time, or, I'll put it in the sort of bluntest sense, we shouldn't be wasting our time reading fiction when we could be doing things that might be more useful in the world or less sort of potentially dangerous and suspect to our minds. I'm curious for your thoughts on what you'd say to somebody who's sort of coming from that angle.
Yeah, I love the way you described it. Fiction is even if it's not The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, fiction is really all about creating a world. And one thing I always tell my students is worlds have, to put it bluntly, is like worlds have a worldview. The way that someone creates a world shows their values and their morality about what they think that world is. And so even, and so whenever I teach Virgil, for instance, I always have students map out the underworld and say, like, what does the way that the underworld is constructed say about Virgil's conception of the world, about how our actions influence what happens to us after we die, about what actually gets you a good place in the underworld versus a bad place, and I understand that, for it can be uncomfortable to put ourselves in worlds that feel out of sync with us. That when you're reading something, you're putting yourself in a world that might not be the world that represents the worldview that you have. But at the same time, I've taught the Aeneid for 12 years. And I haven't yet had a student who's been converted to the worldview of the Aeneid. And in fact, I think when we kind of allow ourselves to explore some of these worlds, like they raise questions that actually can make us think, ponder, and make our faith more real, or at least more studied in a good way, because we have to think about, well, this is what this world says, or this is what this book says about the world. Do I think that? Do I do I think that the world is composed of good people versus evil people? Do I think that the world is like Virgil? Like, do I think like the world is just like a bunch of terrible things that everyone has to go through no matter what? And then at some point you're judged according to how famous and what great acts you do. Do I think that? Yeah, I have not yet had a student who's entirely subscribed to that worldview. So I think just because we walk through a grocery store doesn't mean that we're going to become a grocery store worker. I think that, putting ourselves in these books and exploring these worlds doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be taking on that worldview. But good books, maybe I should put that qualification on this. Like, good books will make us think about what our worldview is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings, two series close to my heart that I read with my kids. And Lord of the Rings is, probably aside from the Bible, my favorite book or book collection. And one of the beautiful things about the Lord of the Rings is that as you walk through it, you're invited into a world where there is real good and real evil, where often people are sort of caught to some extent in between those two. So I love the way that, Gollum in The Lord of the Rings is, you first sort of encounter Gollum as curious and certainly, you put him in the category of bad and very hard to sort of relate to. And then as the story goes on, you find that he comes from a very similar place and has a very similar, he's sort of a very hobbit-like creature originally. Right. And so the hobbits who are sort of meeting him, they're meeting a sort of a corrupted version of themselves rather than something that's like utterly alien to them and that they could never relate to. And you see sort of redeeming moments with Gollum along the way as he starts to be able to sort of engage better with Frodo and Sam towards the end. But in the whole sort of sweep of The Lord of the Rings, you find this ultimate like conviction that however bad things are, that there will be final like triumph of good over evil, and that the way to achieve that triumph of good over evil is not by having the bigger army, but actually by a sort of a surprising sacrifice.
Right.
And it's interesting how much that kind of story resonates with people in the West today. I mean, I think many of, the friends we've sort of made along the way in the academic world would believe something along those lines of like the arc of justice may be long. So the arc of history may be long, but it bends towards justice is sort of often, quoted as a sort of way of thinking about history. But actually, if Christianity isn't true, we don't have any reason to think that. Like we don't, if there isn't a God, then there isn't a sort of moral arc of history that's going anywhere. And we ultimately aren't going to know what good and evil even is. The sort of more that gets, I think, unpicked and disrupted if we take a Christian sort of understanding out of the picture than we realize, and that we can even see in these sort of worlds that are created where there's, series like The Lord of the Rings, unlike the Narnia Chronicles, which are sort of more explicitly Christian and allegorical, that Lord of the Rings is sort of not really like that, but nonetheless sort of strongly, I love how you put it, how somebody creates a world tells you a lot about what they believe. And I think you see a lot of Tolkien's sort of Christianity in that.
Yeah. And like we said about like the slipperiness of the people going both directions in Lord of the Rings, right? People kind of being on, you think Boromir is good, but then he gets seduced into evil. But then you have Gollum going the other direction. And I think like one of the things that I love about the Lord of the Rings and other fantasy theories is that arc towards justice is the basis for hope, which I think is one of the pivotal differences between at least how I approach the world as a Christian and by someone who doesn't have a faith, is that it gives you hope that even when the world just seems to be this sort of in this weird process of entropy and everything's going crazy, there will be judgment and that good will triumph over evil. And I think that is just a profoundly different way of approaching the world when hope is built into your worldview, as opposed to, well, let's just charge in and see how this thing goes.
Right. Yeah. As you think about the kind of reading that you like to do, sort of even aside from your sort of academic work, are there kinds of books that you're drawn to more than others, or are you kind of eclectic reader?
Well, it's funny because I was, whenever I talk to my academic friends, we always joke about how we don't read anymore. We only read because read is work, and therefore we don't read outside of it. But I do find, my favorite, like when I'm really stressed, and the book that I've read over and over and over is Jane Eyre, I've loved that for years, and I've read it probably at least 5 or 6 times, and I pick up different things in it every time. But I love that story because it's in some ways it's an archetypal story. It's like the heroine is encountering a moral dilemma. I guess I see it as the story of where a heroine encounters a moral dilemma. Does she marry the man she loves, or does she retain her moral scruples? Does she do what she thinks is correct in not marrying a man who's already married, basically? And the thing I love about that is that, like, the ending of the story, she gets both. She marries the man she loves, and she's still, but with a good conscience. And I remember writing a paper in college actually about how like there are these moments throughout the novel that just remind us that there is like a providence working through everything in that story, and how like the voices that she hears in the wind, and like there are all these moments that are like they're like leading her to that final moment of like beautiful resolution, like when she meets her blinded Mr. Rochester and they embrace. It's one of the most beautiful moments, I think, in all of English lit. That's what I go back to when I just need to read something.
The comfort reading. Yeah.
The comfort reading.
What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, embracing the Saviour who stays the same when everything else changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, This book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievin.com. I've historically had that relationship with Jane Austen. I'm like profoundly canonical in my taste, unfortunately. But I now,
Well, me too.
the other day I was lying in bed with my son Luke, and we're reading The Lord of the Rings at the moment, and he had his like arm around me, and we were sort of snuggled there, and we were reading one of the sections in the early part of The Lord of the Rings that honestly in any adaptation you would have cut. Like it was sort of a description of like the hobbits sort of in the early stage of their journey, and at one point this fox sort of sees them asleep under a tree, and you hear the fox thinking, how strange to see some hobbits sleeping under a tree. And
I remember that moment.
Well, so Luke, my son was like so amused by the fox's thoughts and so like into it, into all the just exploration of the territory that comes with reading The Lord of the Rings. And I was like, I don't know that I could be any happier right now than like cuddle with my little boy reading The Lord of the Rings to him. There's like a deep comfort in that. There's also, I've been thinking recently about how, you know, it's something I thought about when I was first sort of studying English literature kind of professionally, as it were, how one of the strange and beautiful things about reading as a Christian is that we have such a profoundly sort of spiritual understanding of words, if that makes sense.
Oh, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, so the beginning of John's Gospel, some of our listeners may know it well and some may not at all, but Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all write their accounts of Jesus' life, and they all sort of choose to begin in different ways. And John, rather than beginning with, you know, the beginning of Jesus' ministry as Mark does, or rather than beginning with, you know, Jesus' sort of birth narratives and like the genealogies that went into him, as Matthew and Luke do, John begins with the beginning of the entire universe, or rather before the beginning of the entire universe. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And he ends the sort of opening section with the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And so we see Jesus presented, sort of introduced to us as what, you know, in almost every English translation is translated as the word, the Greek word logos, which, you know, in Greek has a sort of a wider semantic range of meaning, a sort of story or argument or, you know, reason. And we're introduced to this person who is the Word and through whom God created, which then makes a whole new kind of sense of the beginning of the Bible and the book of Genesis, when God is creating things just by saying, just by speaking.
And John is quoting Genesis, right?
Right.
Right. So there's a direct allusion. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. First verse of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. We have this sort of echo there. But as a follower of Jesus, you know, when I'm reading the Bible, I'm encountering God through his word. And when I'm reading outside the Bible, it's not that I'm having the same sort of spiritual experience as I would have reading the Bible, because there's, you know, God's word is from a Christian perspective, like entirely, you know, sacred and inspired and unique and different from any other kind of writing. But at the same time, there is, I guess, a way of thinking and a way of appreciating the power of words and the way in which language sort of relates to reality that I suppose sort of spills over into how I think about reading any other kind of book, and how you know, the expression of ideas and the communication of one human to another is sort of in some ways part of how we image God, as the book of Genesis puts it, that God made us in his image. And I think, you know, one of the ways that we are made in his image is our sort of ability to communicate with one another in spoken language or through written texts as well. And there's sort of something, I don't know, there's something I think especially magical, for want of a better word, as a Christian about reading a beautiful work of literature, you know, like Jane Eyre. Or like, I mean, one of the reasons I'm a follower of Jesus myself is because when I read The Lord of the Rings and I look at the world that Tolkien created, as a Christian, I actually believe that the world is even more enchanted and that there is a more sort of beautiful story being told and a sort of deeper magic, to use C.S. Lewis's language, in our real world than we're ever going to encounter in a work of fiction. I'm curious if that resonates with your experience as well, Rachel.
Yes, I did two thoughts when you were talking about how like the special relationship with words is. I started my career teaching at Columbia, and then I went and taught at an Orthodox Jewish women's college. And so it was the first time that I taught students who had been trained in reading the Bible their whole lives. And it was fascinating because I didn't have to teach them how to do close reading, because they had been, because the practice of studying the Bible is so methodologically similar to how you, the term, how you close read, how you kind of look at the words and pay attention to the words and how they're working and what they're saying in a academic context. And it was so lovely. But sometimes that I encountered that did make these difficult times was they also brought this assumption to literature of what is it trying to teach me? That was like they kept, like they would read this and they read these texts sometimes the texts were not trying to teach them anything because they were not biblical texts. So it was a little different, but like that approach of what is this saying and what is it trying to teach me? I think is a very biblical way of approaching texts. And when you read really good literature, it does kind of be able to take you back from thinking about words as the literal words to kind of the ideas behind the words, almost the opposite process of what John is talking about, right? Yeah. Where the word becomes flesh. You can almost when you read good literature, you can see it's like these little words of the page are almost like the flesh, but then that makes you think about what is behind the words, what the words are saying, and that really is, I mean that's another way of understanding like what close reading is. But and I think that's the thing that when any text, whether it's I was just teaching a Valediction Forbidding Mourning by John Donne, he's talking about a compass, and how his famous metaphor of compass, the 2 points of a compass that you would use in elementary school, like a compass, and how the 2 points of the compass are a metaphor for two people in love, connected, but moving farther apart. And there's a whole lot more to say about that metaphor. But when something is really well written with the physical words on the page, it makes you think about, yes, what does love look like? And what is there, what is the truth behind these words? And that, I mean, it is a privilege to be able to think that way all the time for my job.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about reading books by people who share our beliefs and might be sort of creating a world, or, to go back to your Jewish students sort of question, like, what is this text trying to teach me? Where we would say, yes, I fully agree with what this text is trying to teach me. What are your thoughts on reading books when we know that the author actually has a fundamentally different understanding of reality than we do, and maybe a different sort of ideological agenda, to put it in those terms? I mean, at the end of the day, all of us have an ideological agenda of one kind or another, and I think that language, it's a bit like the word rhetoric gets thrown around as that's just rhetoric. Well, rhetoric can be used for good or evil. But what do you think about reading books, sort of either fiction or non-fiction, by people who, might have a completely different understanding of reality than you? Do you think that's can be a worthwhile pursuit? Is ever a worthwhile pursuit? Is always a worthwhile pursuit? What would be your parameters there?
Well, considering that most of the stuff I read is entirely written by people with a different worldview, I have to think it's a worthwhile pursuit. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. And I do think, I think, like I said before, I do think there's power in reading something and it making you think about what you believe in, and also just appreciate what you believe. Like one of the moments that I and my students always grab onto in Homer's Iliad is when the characters pray to Zeus, and then sometimes he nods his head, which is a yes, and then sometimes he answers half their prayer, and then the other half goes unanswered. And then sometimes he says no, or sometimes he doesn't nod and he ignores their prayers. And, and those moments I always find so heartbreaking, because I know what it is to have a God who listens to me all the time and who always hears and answers our prayers, not always in the way that we expect, but always answered. And to have, and so reading that does make me appreciate so much how my faith is different from that worldview. But even in your example of Harry Potter, something much more modern and contemporary, I do think there is a lot in Harry Potter that can actually reinforce, I think, of what we think. I mean, the world of Harry Potter is, once again, it's also like Lord of the Rings. That's a world that's premised on the battle between good and evil. And it is a world where ultimately evil is defeated. Spoiler.
And in fact, evil is defeated by somebody giving their life up and getting it back, which is, the resurrection stone. And I remember reading an interview with J.K. Rowling several years ago where she said that she intentionally didn't disclose that she was, I don't know where she is right now, sort of faith-wise or otherwise, but at the time that she was releasing the series, she intentionally didn't disclose that she is, I forget exactly how she put it, but depending on the day you ask her, sometimes would call herself a Christian kind of thing, because she didn't want people to, she didn't want to give away the story. She didn't want people to preempt where she was going to go with Harry's sort of death and resurrection experience, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that makes everyone, regardless of whether they're a Christian or not, able to appreciate that ending is that I think there is something deep in all of us that values that the beauty and the heroism of self-sacrifice. And that's something that is very different from most of the worldviews of the texts that I teach. Where we have a God who sacrifices himself for us. That is not what the Greek gods do. So often when I'm teaching, a lot of the texts that I'm teaching right now, students are thinking about what makes a hero. And that's often a question I teach in my justice class. What makes a hero? And and the idea of a hero being willing to sacrifice themselves is such a beautiful, loving concept that I think that even people who are not Christians can understand the value of that and the value of the humility that takes and the love that it takes to be willing to do that. So, I don't think you need to be a Christian to appreciate that ending, but being a Christian certainly gives you a more personal appreciation for it.
Actually, it's so much of how all of us who live in the modern West think has actually been influenced by Christianity, whether or not we realize it. So that would be, a great example of being shaped by that idea that the greatest hero would be the one who laid down his life for others, and especially for those, perhaps who are weakest and most in need, rather than the one who sort of won the most glorious military victory. That it all flows really from Jesus's utterly radical claims about himself as, being the great king sent by God, who had come not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That story, which is so different from the stories that the Greeks and Romans were telling themselves about what their deities would be like, as it were. That story has so profoundly shaped our culture that even if we consider ourselves not Christian at all, we've likely been shaped by a lot of Christian ethics. Jesus's care for the poor and the marginalized and the weak and the sick and children and women and all the people who would be discounted in the culture that Christianity was sort of born into. That we're still living with that legacy, whether we realize it or not.
We've kind of imbibed this idea that greater love hath no man than this, that a man lays down his life for his friends.
Yeah.
Right. It has kind of shaped our understanding of what virtue looks like.
Yeah.
Virtue is not necessarily the pursuit of happiness, as the Greeks would say.
Yeah.
Right. Virtue is often manifest as serving others.
What would you say, as you and I both raising children who we hope and pray will always be followers of Jesus? I know some Christian parents would take the view that we really only want our children to read books by Christian authors and books that are sort of explicitly promoting a Christian understanding of the world. I'm curious whether that's, I've taken a different approach with my kids to say, for sure I love reading them books by Christian authors as well, but I firmly believe that learning about other belief systems is actually going to result in them not sort of being lured away by other belief systems, but actually I think Jesus shines more brightly in contrast with with any other thing else that this world has to offer. But I'm sort of curious for your reflections on that. I know your girls are younger than my girls, at least a similar age to my son, but you're sort of a little earlier in the parenting journey than I am. But I'm curious for your sort of ethos as you think about what books you would read to your girls as they grow up or encourage them to read. Would it just be Jane Eyre all the way?
Yeah. They've already started Frankenstein and Jane Eyre. And I mean, I think I probably have a similar, my husband and I probably have a similar approach to you in that, and this same would also go for our movies that we let our kids watch. We let them watch movies and read books that are not explicitly Christian. And part of that has to do with, as you say, like, reading something doesn't mean necessarily that people be, books are not drugs. Books are not, but they're not, they have no magical power in and of themselves to enchant us into the, I mean, it's not like, what's the diary in Harry Potter? Like, it's not that diary.
Tom Riddle's diary.
Tom Riddle's, like most books are not like that. But also, I think that it's really important for us to be, as parents, to be able to help our kids as they encounter things that are different from what they believe. Because I would hate that I would raise my kids in a wonderful Christian bubble, and then they go out and realize the world is not the same as that bubble, and then have a nervous breakdown because they were not prepared for it. And so, I think that as parents, by all means, we can exercise. I have a lot of things that I've said to my kids, no, let's not watch that. But often but usually the criteria is not, is it Christian or is it non-Christian? But is this educational? Or is this worthwhile? Which I think is a slightly different standard. Because there are lots of, I'm sure you encountered there are lots of like mindless TV shows on streaming platforms that like are just meant to keep your kids glued to the screen while their parents are doing something else. And there's no moral taught. There's no, there's no moral taught. There's no lesson. There's no scientific or other information communicated. It's just mindless entertainment. And I think books can do that too. So I want my kids to be learning and thinking, but then I also, like, as they encounter that, now I'm alongside them. So when they encounter something that they have a question about, or I can even ask them, like, what did you think about X? Or if it's, so at least as they encounter things that might challenge their worldview, I'm with them alongside them encountering it rather than them being all by themselves.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, the approach that I've taken with my kids, and to be clear, there are plenty of books that I would on principle not read and that I would never want my kids to read either. I mean, there are plenty of books that are filled with essentially sort of pornographic descriptions that none of us need to be, just to let the record show that. But yeah, it's interesting, even anytime I'm like maybe watching TV with my kids, which it's funny, we actually rarely do that because we'll sometimes watch films together or sort of something like that. But like occasionally we'll be watching, I don't know, like a sport game or something, and there'll be adverts will come up. And what I always have my kids do is analyze what that commercial is saying. Because it'll be like, you see this car advert and you see, I don't know, the beautiful woman draped on the car or whatever. And I want them to be able to look at that and say, the advert is telling you, if you buy this car, you will get that beautiful woman. And when you say these things out loud, they are obviously ridiculous. But if you don't, if you just kind of let the message seep into you, then you have no defenses against it. But if you kind of explicitly say what they're saying, wear these shoes and you will suddenly be the popular girl at school. Like when you say that, it's ridiculous. Or if it's true, you sort of have to ask yourself questions about the standards that people are judging you by. But we need to sort of, I want to build into my kids a kind of critical lens to be able to say, okay, what is this communicating, even if it's not saying it explicitly? And that applies whether we're watching a commercial, whether we're watching a film, whether we're reading a book, that we'd be able to say, what is this teaching, even if it's not, because most often it's not saying it in like as many words, but it's sort of communicating it in a different way. And for them to, as you say, be able to navigate that, especially, one day when they've left the confines of my home, as it were, to be equipped to do that. But I think at the same time, And this is something that I find reading really helpful for. If one of Jesus' distinctives morally is that we are to love our enemies. Jesus teaches we should love our neighbor as ourselves, and then we should love even the people most hostile to us. So let's think about, your or my ideological enemies in the world today, people who might believe completely different things than we do and might even, might think that we are not only foolish, but sort of evil for believing what we believe, for example. What does it mean to love somebody who is my ideological enemy? Well, a good first step would be just like understanding where they're coming from. And sometimes reading a book, it could be a work of fiction, or it could be a work of nonfiction where somebody's sort of making the case for their beliefs. And I had the opportunity to hear them out, to understand where they're coming from, why they believe, what stories they're telling themselves. That then puts me in a better position to be able to love them. And loving somebody doesn't mean affirming all their choices or all their beliefs at all, but it does mean taking the time to understand them as a person and to sort of show love to them. And sometimes, if I'm reading something that a lot of other people are reading as well, I'm naturally somebody who honestly would mostly read things by dead people, but I'm trying to read more and more things by people who are alive, or the kinds of things that people are reading at the moment, so that I can sort of understand, what messages they're hearing, where they're coming from, what's forming and shaping them, and to be able to hopefully love them better in that context.
Well, and that's actually getting to one of the great strengths of literature itself, right? Is that, and lots of people have written about this in relation to the novel, that literature is one of the best vehicles for creating empathy, right? For understanding other people's perspectives. And when you read like a Toni Morrison novel, for instance, there are characters that they don't do the right thing. Their choices are wrong, but you still understand and empathize for, and you feel compassion for them, even though that their actions are wrong and reprehensible. And that's another aspect of reading literature that I think can really help us is when literature helps you get into, especially post 19th century literature, it's premised on the idea of getting into understanding what a character is thinking and feeling. And that can be really a wonderful lesson in how to love people. And that's something that, I'm always, I always think of it when I read Toni Morrison, because I always ask my students, they're like, oh, well, they always, because her novel, Song of Solomon, you think this, you start out thinking that everything is black and white. And then you realize, no, people are so much more nuanced. And I think like that novel is just an exercise in how does our perspective change when we learn to love someone unconditionally, and how does our perspective, and with still recognizing that, for example, it's wrong to abuse your family, and it's wrong to, do all these things that the characters do, but at the same time, you have compassion for them, and literature is great for teaching compassion, and what it means to take a compassionate view towards people.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and it's not the same as agreeing with their choices or their beliefs, but to understand somebody puts us in a position to love them as Jesus calls us to if we're his followers. Rachel, last question. I tend to ask people on this podcast how they first became a Christian, and I really enjoy your story, which I know happened some time ago. So I wanted our listeners to hear that as well. It's a little different from some of the stories that we've had on this podcast before.
Yeah. You were talking about, you want your kids to be critical thinkers. There's not too much critical thinking involved in my story. So I was born in a Christian family, and so I was going to church from utero and being in utero, and so I heard, and I think I understood the gospel message very early. When I was around 5 or 6, we were sitting at a Sunday evening service, which was a little more casual than the Sunday morning services at our church. And they were doing communion, which now that I think about it, I didn't realize we did communion in the evening, but I guess we did. We were serving communion, which is when, in our church, there was grape juice and crackers are passed around, and as a way of remembering what Jesus did and as remembering the lessons that he taught at the Last Supper when he fed bread and wine to his disciples. And so And so I was going around and I turned to my dad. I'm like, I asked, I was hungry and I wanted the crackers. And so I asked him if I could have the crackers. And somehow that became completely misconstrued. And he thought that I meant that I wanted to make a profession of faith. And I guess he gave me more credit than I deserved in terms of my spiritual maturity. And so he brought me to the front of the church and he announced to everyone that I had decided to become a Christian. And I was terrified because I felt like, oh no, I'm committing fraud against God. I'm lying to God. And so this service ended and I remember running to the church steps and just saying, I'm so sorry, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, I wasn't trying to lie to you. Because those seeds had been planted already, because I knew the gospel story, I could say, but Lord, like, I do want to follow you. Like, I didn't mean to lie, but like, I do believe in you. I do want you to be the Lord of my life. And so I asked Jesus to come into my heart then. But I mean, and it was many years before I fully appreciated, I think, how that should affect my life, partly because I was all alone and I was too ashamed to admit that those were the circumstances under which I accepted Christ. So for many years I had doubt of like, did I do it right? And so it really wasn't until I was a tween or a teenager that I remember just like praying like, Lord, like, please just remove all my doubt. And if I wasn't saved before, please save me now because I want to be fully committed to you. And since that time, I've never doubted my salvation. That doesn't mean to say that I've always acted as someone who has been saved by grace, but that knowledge that Jesus has offered us eternal life and that we can accept that gift has never left me since then.
Well, thanks so much for joining me, Rachel, and for sharing your childlike faith from once upon a time, sort of come across by accident. I love that story because at the end of the day, we're all hungry, one way or another. And Jesus, as he put it himself, he's the bread of life. So in some ways, you weren't actually wrong to be wanting to join in because you were just hungry. I think there's actually a kind of profoundly like spiritual dimension to that. And you guys who've been listening, you've been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram if you go near either of those things on a regular or irregular basis. And between now and next time I speak into your earphones, maybe think about that, reflect on whether Jesus might be who you're hungering for, whether his word might be what you and I most need, and whether he might be the one who truly is the Word who was with God before all time and through whom all things were made and who became flesh in order to save the likes of Rachel and of me.